All right, we are live and welcome to this week's discussion of Night's Watch, which will focus on Disney's The Incredibles as well as Stephen King's Misery. So kicking things off with The Incredibles. Where would the group like to start?
Start with Mr. Incredible, I guess.
Okay. What did you observe?
So he's definitely someone, like, classic case of someone who, like, obviously, not, I won't say peaked in high school, but like one of those people who had like a very good glory days era, and then something happened, and suddenly now he has to adjust to being a regular person, which is obviously a huge struggle for him. Considering he's still Mr. Incredible. I would say that he, during that time, has obviously displayed like very much symptoms of depression. He finds no joy in his like current work. The only joy I guess he finds is like sneaking out with Lucius and finding time still. So in terms of like who he is, he like withdrew from his family. He's struggling at work. He's like getting yelled at by his boss.
I don't know if it'll come up in your shelf exam, but what theorist might we discuss to kind of provide a proper context of what you just said?
Erickson.
Yeah.
So kind of like stagnant.
Yeah, so I mean, the idea that he proverbially peaked in high school, he's someone who maybe as early as adolescence figured it out. So we're dealing with identity. And if he hadn't, then role confusion. But then he's asked, if not told, you must change your identity, right? That which you achieved as an adolescent will need to be undone because you're no longer that person. You can't be legally. And now he's either a young adult or perhaps even middle adult. And if middle adult, he's preparing, building on identity, followed by intimacy. Now looking at himself in the mirror and determining, hey, is this it? And if this were linear and if there were no obstacles, the answer would be, yeah. I mean, I am Mr. Incredible. This is it. Unfortunately, there is an obstacle, right? He's told he can't be and can't have that identity. Again, borrowing right from Ericksonian's 8-part stage theory. So here he is trying to struggle with generativity, midlife, mid-adulthood, and he's unable to achieve that because he's not allowed to say, yeah, this is it, because it isn't it. The law has told him no. And therefore we see a character that is therefore stagnated. That's the alternative to generativity, stagnation, which you identified as depression, which is fairly synonymous here, right? So I think the growth, if you will, of Mr. Incredible, I think serves well to review the Ericksonian theory, these 8 stages. And by the way, if he doesn't correct this, now I know the ending of the movie is what it is, but if we had a darker ending and therefore Incredibles 2 went in that route, we'd be looking at someone then who is struggling with ego integrity versus despair. That is, that stagnation is going to get worse. And we're looking at someone who, at older age, is struggling with depression. Right? Other thoughts of Mr. Incredible in this context? I mean, he has other stuff going on, but in this context, any further thoughts?
And to illustrate even more, like I guess when he gets the call to like become a hero again, you see him this like dramatic transformation. Like he starts lifting weights, he goes better. He's like his entire life is like he's like his kids. He's like he and his wife seem to be on better terms and stuff like that. You just see the reversal almost. Like he's gone out of stagnant, and now he's like found his purpose again.
That's exactly what happens.
So it's like almost illustrates it perfectly.
Yeah. I don't know if we use the word regress, but he's allowed to basically pull from adolescence or that which he achieved in adolescence and is given the green light. No, you can in fact do this. And now as he looks himself in the mirror and asks, is this it? He's allowed to say, yes, it is. I am that person I thought I was, that identity that I originally established during adolescence. Now, in between young adult, we have intimacy versus isolation. As we see this struggle, on, off, on again, well, as we see this play out in the plot of The Incredibles, does issues pertaining to intimacy also become affected? Because we would expect it to. It's not a given that everybody reads the textbook, much less Erickson. But that is that middle stage that we keep on skipping over, going back and forth between adolescence and mid-adult life. How is his relationship with his wife during this?
I'd say poor, I guess, because she's hiding this whole thing from her, like, they're not speaking, and there's like a allusion, I guess, to it where like she finds like the hair on his like jacket and it's like obviously suspects something is up, listens in on his phone call. So there's that tension, you can see it, they don't necessarily explicitly say but
Right. Much less a psychiatrist. So, and Disney does follow the Ericksonian script here, to the extent that they highlight that those issues pertaining to intimacy, they didn't neglect it. They actually read the 8 stages of man, they understand Ericksonian theory, and they didn't ignore how an individual regressing back to adolescence, if we're going to use that word, might also have issues pertaining to intimacy versus isolation, in as much as it's that middle step, young adulthood specifically. All right, other than Erik Erikson, anything else you want to discuss in the context of this character? Other characters you want to discuss as part of Disney's The Incredibles?
I volunteer, I guess, Dash, I think he's a good example of acting out.
So what is acting out?
An immature defense, I guess.
Would you say defense?
Yeah.
Well, you're right. Valiant, look, immature. That's what's the defense? Anything that is Micah Parsons contributing to. What's a defense? And for those of you who didn't get that and are not Cowboy fans, you have failed your rotation.
It's like, the defense is like something uncomfortable is happening, so it's like, what mechanism are we gonna use to deal with it, and then defense is gonna be like adaptive or like maladaptive,
Right.
Right.
That's exactly right. So these are unconscious processes, specifically per Freud, unconscious processes of the ego, which is a little redundant. But they work towards, as you mentioned, resolving anxiety. So there's something going on with Dash as to why he's anxious. And as a result of that, he's going to adopt a defense or multiple defenses, and one that, or anyone, I should say, that might become rigid can lend to character pathology. And in this case, acting out. Now, if acting out in a general sense, not necessarily to Dash, although we might go back and reapply it to him. If I had somebody in this room who went to and utilized acting out rigidly, 24/7, that was your go-to. What condition might you be at risk for developing? Yeah. And related? Yeah, well, okay, now, and a little older. Yeah, there's your continuum. Yeah. Now, if the acting out is in the context of other signs and symptoms hallmarked by the cardinal feature of a blatant disregard for and violation of others' rights, we're going to call that antisocial personality disorder. There's a couple other things we have to tweak here, but that's going to be our provisional diagnosis. And the physical assaults, for example, will be attributed to that. On the other hand, if not, and the physical assaults in and of themselves warrant independent clinical attention, that is, and we can't attribute it to a larger condition, intermittent explosive disorder then becomes your most likely diagnosis. You would not necessarily diagnose both. When you could attribute those physical assaults to antisocial, you wouldn't also attribute them to intermittent explosive disorder. Right? In this case, antisocial personality would be considered to be the larger illness that explains the intermittent and explosive behavior through acting out. How old was Dash?
Elementary age. Exactly.
Younger than 15?
Probably, yeah.
Any evidence of conduct disorder?
Putting attacks on his teachers. Chair. Oh, conduct.
Well, that's
Yeah.
along the lines go.
Disregard for.
Yeah.
Rules.
Yeah. Now, again, we need a number threshold, but again, Disney's not gonna read the DSM and make sure we get to that number. Similar to a case vignette, if you're given one or two signs and symptoms and you know you need 5. You're not gonna leave the question blank saying no. I mean, the single best answer will still be the one that requires the 5, even though all 5 are not in your clinical vignette. So be careful. Nobody's gonna leave any answers blank on your shelf to make a point, right? And we could apply that same strategy to analyzing film. So ODD versus conduct disorder would be in the differential here for Dash as well, which means that there probably is somewhat of a risk for developing antisocial personality disorder, depending on further development, of course, and therefore the sequels. Other observations for Dash?
Or make a diagnosis of ADHD, but that obviously kind of goes with super complex, so I mean. Yeah, but I mean, they also, I guess, see like the normal child, like the normal sibling development, I guess, when him fighting with his older sister. But that's always like a classic thing that when they say like, oh, child fights with his older sister, but doesn't like have this with anyone else. And shows like, it's just like, that's normal for siblings to fight, but not necessarily fight with other people and stuff, when you're talking about like ODD or.
Once it becomes more pervasive, absolutely.
Yeah.
Mhm. All right, you did mention something I wanted to examine briefly. I'm blanking what it was. Before you mentioned his sister, there was another comment you made. Do you remember what the observation?
Normal fighting with his sister.
I'm blanking. I'm sorry, guys. No. We're right up to the bottom of the hour. Any final thoughts on either Dash or any other of the characters from Disney's The Incredibles? All right, let's switch this over now. We didn't get to Syndrome, although there is a tagline stated by Syndrome that allows for the easy segue to our next film. Anybody pick up on what that tagline is? Yeah, so that, I mean, there's no doubt that Disney made sure that they had a Stephen King Easter egg hidden in this movie, which is our segue then to examine that very Stephen King film titled Misery. So for this particular film, we have about 20 minutes or so left. Where would you like to start?
We started with the scene where Andy rescues. Paul.
Mhm.
Rescues Paul from his car.
What about that scene?
It seemed to, I had like relief when I watched that, like someone's gonna prevent him from breathing his back, but I quickly realized that her intentions may be a bit different. Also just that like the chances that someone happened to see his car fly off the road and land where it was. Also made me suspicious that this is something that probably watched.
Did you think that when you saw the car go off the road, or was it after several moments of this film where Annie begins to decompensate and then you remember that scene? How did it work out for you?
I think I started to feel it when the scene of her crying opened the door and then not showing who it was. The fact that they didn't show that it was like, you know, like a firefighter or something. It wasn't somebody in uniform. I became suspicious that it was somebody.
It just so happened to be someone whose property it was. Clearly didn't see the crash. Or if they did, they happened to be in the right place at the right time during inclement weather, which basically is setting up the idea that she sabotaged that road. Right. And we get information to support her sabotaging the road later on in the movie when she tells him, I've been following you, or I knew, I would watch you in that cabin or in that lodge. And it probably is more than just what we might call normal fandom. There's more going on here. Right, so this was orchestrated by her. This was premeditated. And those feelings of relief upon her crying him out and then nurturing him back to health, because that's continued until we get to a point in the movie where we then reach a plateau and then see a decompensation. Right, so more information on Annie here. What else might be going on here?
I think in terms of like her history before the movie begins, there's just, it's very just subtly hinted at, and we never really find out so much about her background, other than we see some photographs around her home, presumably of what the dead cows potentially. But we don't really find out all that much about her, I guess.
There are suspicious infant and child deaths at the hospital where
Right.
she's taken to court for it.
But as far as, oh, I'm sorry.
No, please, no.
Just as far as sort of like where the breakdown happened, we don't really find out much about like who she was in childhood or anything like that. That led her to potentially become the person that she is now.
But I have, again, this is cheating. It's coming from the book. But I'll provide you the information, because if you were to ask me as a collateral, I would provide something that perhaps Annie herself would not be able to provide, and that is upon the death of her husband, she throws herself into this fantasy world. She takes all night shifts at the hospital, so it's quiet and she could basically escape reality. And as part of that escape, she throws herself into these Paul Sheldon novels, where this fantasy world becomes hers. And Paul Sheldon becomes the creator. He becomes, in her eyes, God. And one of the things that happens that disrupts this inner world that she's regressed into, maybe as part of a schizoid personality, is that she actually gets to meet the very person that she feels saved her life. And that meeting does not go as planned. And when somebody you idealize is actually in reality someone quite different, we could see a potential outcome, right? So this looks to be, in terms of precipitant, upon the death of her spouse. And then perpetuating factor, this autistic retreat through fantasy. That's a defense mechanism, so that she could protect herself from the anxiety of struggling with the death of her husband, which, by the way, is probably traumatic reenactment. There's probably a seminal death earlier in her childhood that she has to go back and revisit, because now her husband's death reminds her of it, and that could be her father. Right. So this is something we might read between the lines. We'd have to definitely ask that particular patient named Annie if this were an office visit, but this is a definite area we would need to explore as a clinician. And not exploring it might lead to adverse outcomes. And all you got to do is ask Paul that. Now, there's other evidence that Annie, younger, death of her father, felt that her life, her immediate surroundings were imminently threatening, and she lost any sense of control. So if somebody is in that situation, how might they react as a 6-year-old or 7-year-old?
Very religious. She definitely, like, she says Bible, maybe she kind of turned to that as a coping mechanism.
So you could look for parental extenders that have very strict and rigid rules.
Would, like, caring for animals be or like, just, I like her being on a farm and taking care of animals, it really provides her with a sense of, I can protect these things are mine.
It could be, and in that way, my own personal, if not professional bias, would be that would be a constructive way to go about it. Right. Developing empathy. But there's something else. I mean, generally speaking, the child will take measures to somehow regain control over their life. Right. I mean, if a child feels that there is a loss of control, measures will be taken to ensure that they gain control over their life. And it's not this simplistic, but one example might be an eating disorder. Okay, what evidence in the film demonstrates that Annie has some traits that are consistent with her having resorted to taking the control back in her life as a child?
Like orderliness.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. 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 Once she discovers that Penguin not facing due south the way it should, obsessive compulsive personality had to come up in everybody's mind. And that just does not pop up out of nowhere. Right. And now, does that always mean that there's absolute and abject chaos as a child? No, not necessarily. But the information that we are provided through that scrapbook and other bits of information, perhaps from the novel itself, does start to paint the picture. And boy, now does this become consistent, right? So obsessive compulsive personality, orderliness, control. Annie must be in control, right? What else?
Remember I thought it was something kind of similar to Fatal Attraction was like the early death of the fathers and each of their women's lives. And I actually thought, and I don't know if the book kind of like speaks to it in a different way, but it seemed like Annie's father's death was also a freak accident. And I was like, maybe she had something to do with that death, especially because the next page in that like memory and scrapbook is like the report of a death of which nursing student. And then the next page after that is her like writing in the arms. So like it shows something to do with the classmate's death, but so that she can make her way to the top.
And as far as the classmate is concerned, I don't think there's any doubt about that. But your observation, taking it one step further and applying it to the father, I think is also accurate. We'd have to ask, at the very least, there'd be an inquiry there. Right. And again, and if we go that route and we begin to get information that might support what we're thinking, there's going to be part of us as a clinician that takes a step back, albeit for a brief second, and think, wait, this doesn't make sense. You just got done telling us that her life seems so out of control because of loss of her father, and now she's the one who actually killed him or contributed to his death. And the answer is that can happen. Yes, it's not a straightforward thing. That is human behavior, where when this begins to just not connect, we need to abandon. This needs to be further investigated. Yeah, and even with Alex, when is it that a daughter might actually feel both incredible regret and a loss of sense of self upon the death of her father, yet have contributed to the very death?
It was like an accident or something.
It could be, yeah, that certainly could be an accident. Right, but the contributing to his death might actually be the product of early childhood sexual abuse, just like Alex. Now, again, I don't know if, I mean, and when I say the novel, I went to see the Broadway play, which was based on the novel. So that's where I'm getting the info from the novel. I didn't read it, right? But that's something we would definitely investigate as to this ambivalence an individual may have, whether her name is Alex, whether her name is Annie, or anyone else for that matter. Right, ambivalence exists for a reason, and not the initial or new patient evaluation, but perhaps in psychotherapy, we could try to get some answers. Is there any more to Annie's character?
Like the first time I kind of saw her transform being the little care and sweet to her being really like aggressive. Those followers when after she read the manuscript, she came back into the room and she was like, "What is this?" Like, and she kind of said, "Can you bring the book clear like I'll burn you." So to me, it kind of looked like severe like splitting, like, "Oh, I love you, like I idolize you," but then once you kind of go against it, she's like, "I hate you, you're the worst person ever."
And very, very labile. Right. I mean, and as soon as that happens the first time, as an audience member watching this movie, we're done, because now we don't know who's walking through that door, right? So we can empathize with the main character or the other main character, Paul, and being so concerned over his safety slash our safety to the extent that we identify with this character of who's walking through that door. Is it going to be good Annie? Is it going to be bad Annie? Because we don't like bad Annie, especially when we're tied up and hobbled.
She didn't like the book because he was like cursing in it. I thought it was interesting that she uses like very childish words and substitution for like expletives, and then there was one scene where they're fighting where she actually curses back at him. I don't know if it was like, it was, I guess it was kind of crazy, but.
Yeah.
That was like a notable, like switching her. Yeah.
So what we perhaps surmise in this is that, you know, she's got this impulse. And she has got an overdeveloped superego. That makes her dress the way she does, as if she's a Puritan. Behave the way she does, choose the words that she does. But it's like a cork with a lot of pressure building up beneath. And that's likely the result of a very overbearing and overdeveloped superego. Now, again, where she gets that from, we have to ask. Where does that come from? Because that doesn't happen overnight, right? There's some history there. But when she shows quote unquote her true self, when those impulses come to the surface, boy, I mean, it's like a volcano, right? Largely because of how repressed those impulses are by this overdeveloped superego. It's exactly what we're seeing here. So Paul understands he's got to play to that superego. He better not, you know, have anything or provide any cues that would allow that impulse to come to conscious awareness again, because we need that volcano to remain dormant. There's even more to this character in terms of what she demonstrates.
I think like for me as a viewer, the biggest like the point where I felt most disappointed was when she knocked over the glass of wine that had the medication in it. And so I think for me, there was that question of like, did she know, how could she have possibly known that he was plotting this? Did she know? Was it an accident? I think like reflecting back now, like that one was purposeful. Given like her, I guess some people were really nice, and she probably was keeping very close tabs on how many of those pills were in the closet, and then when he stole several like packets of them, she probably found out.
Probably did. I mean,
Yeah, so I don't know, but I think like that was sort of like a key moment in terms of just like how much does she really know about what he's doing?
and I mean, given the fact, and we'll establish this as fact now, at the very least for the sake of discussion, that she didn't know he was trying to poison her or overdose her. What's her endgame? I mean, if a person realizes they just escaped the potential of being overdosed, drugged, there might be a reaction that we expect. But in this case, I'm wondering why she continues the charade and what therefore her end game is. Now, is it simply to rewrite Misery back into her life? Because it could be. Remember, him killing off Misery is in her mind, Paul Sheldon killing her off. Right. And this was a direct message from the author, who prior to has always spoken to her through these books. Right. And the message she got from this latest was bad. It was not the message she was ready to receive. Rejection, abandonment, a replay of her husband, which itself was a replay of her dad. Right. And again, like Dan Gallagher, she's not going to be ignored. But I don't know if there's anything beyond that, because it might be that she needs him to reauthor this for her, to set her life back straight. Maybe there isn't anything beyond that. Maybe that is enough.
I'm not sure, maybe I thought I'm gonna such kind of advice to people over the situation again, like I'm saying, like, at the end, she's in like, kill both of them together, so like, if we want to meet, we'll do both, just like that, and her way out, like, how she, controls the situation.
And that could definitely be it. I mean, and again, I know we discussed this, it seems like a year ago now, but in David Fincher's Seven, that could be her legacy, just like John Doe. She dies doing this and nobody will ever forget her story. Right? I mean, her story becomes much bigger than anything Paul Sheldon ever wrote. She actually co-authored the biggest story of them all with this murder-suicide. So that actually probably is it. Because she lives forever there. Right? And has a bunch of medical students every 5 weeks talking about her. Right? So a couple of quick things I want to point out. Number one is that we can't dismiss the fact that Annie Wilkes isn't psychotic here. She clearly is. She suffers from delusions, and I suggest that without evidence of schizophrenia, that we might consider delusional disorder mixed type, in which prior to the prequel, she demonstrates automatic delusions. She really believes that Paul Sheldon has a relationship that Paul would not say exists. And then there's also the grandiose delusion after she tells Paul that she spoke to God. And God gave her the reason why Paul showed up at her cabin the way he did. So it might be mixed type.
I had also thought about the erotomania delusion, but then there's a scene where she says, like, she tells him that he loves him, but she's like, I know you don't love me. Yeah. Like, that made me think differently. So I feel like someone with delusional disorder wouldn't have the insight to realize that the person doesn't love them back.
Right, and that gets to my next point, perfect cue. By the way, we didn't talk about this. This is not scripted. So when you discover that, now you recognize, well, even before we would have ruled in delusional disorder, we would likely have investigated other conditions that would have attributed to her delusion, that is explained her being psychotic. And a primary mood disorder would be at the top of that list, as with substances, as with a medical condition. But without any evidence of substances or a medical condition, AKA an organic pathology or etiology, maybe a primary mood disorder. And in such a case, individuals will, quote unquote, only demonstrate mood symptoms without psychosis. And when they do, there might be that insight. So I think she loses that erotomanic delusion largely because she is no longer psychotic within the context of the larger mood disorder. Does that make sense? Right. So that's the exact way I would formulate this. And then when we cheat and we even recognize more of this backstory, this idea of a primary mood disorder is actually supported. What am I talking about? Specifically bipolar disorder. So this is the second season of the Netflix series Castle Rock, right? Which is a young Annie Wilkes with established bipolar. Right. So it's right there in the script, which allows for some consistency with regard to how we are now interpreting the signs and symptoms manifest in the original movie. Right. So this might be bipolar. I'm going to actually sign off here. Let's sign off. There's a quick 5-minute didactic before we get you guys out of here on time. So I'm going to sign off the web.